Speaker.
I call the member for Maitland.
Thank you, Mr Temporary Speaker, and I rise to speak on the Civil Liability Amendment Institutional Child Abuse Bill introduced by the Shadow Attorney-General, and I commend the member for Liverpool and Shadow Attorney-General for his ongoing commitment to supporting victims of child sexual abuse in this state. And to listen to the Attorney-General's words of support and comfort for those victims and survivors of this child sexual abuse in this state and institutional child abuse, one could be forgiven for coming to the same conclusion that the Attorney-General did, that he commended the bill to this House. But yet again, from this government, we see a reluctance to act quickly on this issue. We hear words like acting now would be premature, we're going to wait until the middle of the year, we don't want organisations to be so overburdened that they can't help, and obviously the government has come along with their legislation to allow Commonwealth redress. But I want to clarify from the outset, for the benefit of my colleagues on the other side of this House, that this bill deals with the common law scheme, so it is separate from the Attorney-General's bill. And the Attorney-General has been saying how he wants to support the Royal Commission's recommendations. And yet again, we see in this place the politicisation of these well-meaning words, because they will not accept good legislation that's been put forward by our side of this House in order to make sure that things happen for survivors in an urgent manner. People who are victims of this abuse are often in a very elderly state. Every delay that we have of not having this legislation put in place means that there is a survivor out there continuing to wait. I first started looking at this issue back some 20 or 30 years ago now, probably 20 years ago now, when I worked for the Department of Immigration and prepared a submission on behalf of the Commonwealth Government around the guardianship of children under the Minister for Immigration in the British Child Migrant Scheme. And the stories that I read and the survivors that I spoke to at that time have left an absolute horror in me of the suffering that those children endured in government-run and charity-run organisations. And we need to actually do something about this. And we have got, after the work of people like Joanne McCarthy, who shone a light on this, the work of Julia Gillard that led to the establishment of the Royal Commission, we have a moment in time. And to keep hearing, we've got to wait, is disrespectful to all of those who have spent the time sharing their stories, sharing the trauma that they have lived through, and are waiting for this government to take action. You know, we have the Attorney-General saying that 150,000 is all right. Well, actually, it's not all right. It was 200,000. That was what was recommended. And we need the government to act on this. The report recommended that the state and territory governments introduce legislation that made institutions explicitly liable for child sexual abuse that's committed by persons associated with the institution. This is unless the institution can prove that it took reasonable steps to prevent the abuse. It's inconceivable that this government has so far failed to act on a number of these recommendations. Well, they didn't get it 3 minutes ago. This report was released in 2015. It is now 2018. Other jurisdictions, such as Victoria, have already acted to make this recommendation law. The Victorian Andrews government is leading the way in their response to sexual assault and child sexual abuse. And this is in contrast to the Berejiklian government, which has repeatedly failed to release its sexual assault strategy on schedule. In October 2015, Minister Goward promised that a strategy would be released in 6 months' time. This date has come and gone without any strategy from the Minister. The release date was then moved out to November 2016. To this date, the strategy is still not released. It's over 2 years since the strategy was due, 2.5 years since it was promised to the community. And of course, these recommendations from the Royal Commission should be part of that. What kind of message does it send to the survivors of sexual assault in this state that the Liberal National Government is too busy to put together a sexual assault strategy? They're now saying wait another 6 months for a comprehensive package, and is failing to support legislation from this side of the House that would go to enabling civil litigation to commence for people who are suffering and who have suffered enough. Sexual assault and child sexual abuse are extremely serious matters. Our response to preventing these crimes should be bipartisan, and so should our response to actually ensuring that those who have suffered from this crime are able to have the full remit of civil and common law and government redress schemes available to them in terms of healing from that abuse. But when a government routinely fails to implement these policies, fails to prevent these crimes, fails to implement adequate redress schemes, we on this side of the House will not be silent. As Shadow Minister for the Prevention of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, I am committed to preventing sexual assault in this state, but I am also committed to ensuring that the past wrongs that have been done to so many children who are now adults is redressed properly at all levels of the law and under all schemes. The Labor opposition in this state will not stand by and wait for the government to act. This bill will clarify an ambiguity that is in our current laws, which the government has failed so far to address. And no kind words from the Attorney-General or from the Minister will actually enact that. This requires legislation. The government has to take responsibility. Currently, there's a clear civil liability for perpetrator of child sexual abuse, and this law is less clear when it comes to institutions. I note the Attorney-General's comments that he was concerned about overburdening those institutions. What about the abuse and crimes that they have committed against children, in some cases for generations? That should be at the centre of our concern. There are several issues that arise only when only perpetrators are held liable. If a perpetrator passes away or has no assets, the ability of a victim to receive damages is unclear. In contrast, the institutions that fail to prevent abuse are more likely to be able to pay out damages. This bill will ensure that a clear civil liability for child sexual abuse exists in New South Wales. This is an important change. It goes some way to ensuring that the victims of child sexual abuse are able to receive appropriate redress from the institutions who failed them. We have to act to ensure that each and every victim has an equal ability to achieve damages through civil litigation. It is clear that our society has repeatedly failed victims of child abuse. And while we acknowledge that the government is supporting the redress scheme, albeit at the $150,000 level rather than $200,000 level, and that for some victims will mean that they don't take the civil route to redress, for some that is just so clearly not enough that they need to have this open to them. Historically, we as a society have failed to protect them from the abuse, and we have failed to hold these institutions to account. This bill will go some way towards that. Unless an institution can prove that they have taken reasonable steps to prevent abuse from occurring, then it will be held liable. This reversed onus of proof reflects what our society expects of our institutions. No one would allow anyone that they cared about or loved to go to an institution of any kind unless they could be sure that they would be cared for properly. When a parent places their child in an organisation's care, they expect that organisation to take every step reasonable to keep them safe, and where there are no parents available to make that choice or to have that concern, the state should have that concern. If a vulnerable child is placed in the care of an institution because of those parents being unwilling or incapable of looking after them, as a society, we all have that expectation. It doesn't go away. If an institution fails to take every step reasonable to prevent child sexual abuse, then this bill will ensure that that institution will be held accountable through litigation. This bill is survivor-focused, and it's about providing justice to those survivors. Mr. Temporary Speaker, I'd ask for a small extension of time.
Question is the member's time be extended. All those with that opinion say aye. If the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Member for Maitland.
Thank you. This bill will force each and every institution and organisation in this state who is responsible for the care, supervision or has authority over children to take steps to prevent child sexual abuse. This is not groundbreaking stuff. This is a basic expectation of everyone in our community. The revelations that arose from Joanne McCarthy's groundbreaking reporting in the Newcastle Herald and from the Royal Commission's work has caused all of us to reflect on the true cost, the true nature of this insidious crime. But reflection is not enough. We have to expect more from all institutions with whom we entrust the most sacred duty of all, the care of our children. The legal duty that's imposed by the bill will create a financial incentive for every relevant institution to ensure that they are doing everything they reasonably can to prevent child abuse. This duty will do more than just provide an avenue for survivors to seek compensation. It will encourage institutions to act and to ensure that they have effective preventative measures in place to stop child sexual abuse. Unfortunately, there are people and institutions in our society that need that incentive in order to take the necessary steps. The definition of reasonable steps will vary from institution to institution. It will vary depending on the nature of the organisation and the type of the position that the perpetrator held there. More will be expected, obviously, of commercial institutions than community-based ones, but we need to make sure that they are all safe. This bill will implement one of the most important recommendations of the Royal Commission. The Attorney-General and Minister Goward have announced that they will announce the New South Wales Government's official response to each of the Commission's recommendations by June. I hope that that deadline is met. I also hope that this deadline will be followed by Minister Goward and that we will not have a set of dates that are missed, such as we've had with the sexual assault strategy. The work completed by the Royal Commission is a blueprint for this state's response to preventing child sexual abuse in the state. But I question why it's taken so long for the government to act on the recommendations. And the Attorney-General's accused us of not being serious in this matter because we didn't make a submission on the government's discussion papers on these matters. While the government was doing that, we were drafting legislation through the Shadow Attorney-General, a member for Liverpool. Unlike the government, who's happy to make hollow promises about their commitments to preventing sexual assault in this state, we are acting. We are putting forward legislation to make change. The government can talk, and the opposition will continue to introduce legislation that will genuinely improve our state's response to child sexual abuse. I am so sick of being in this chamber and hearing the government going on about how they're first in the nation to do this and first in the nation to do this. It's about time that they started looking a little bit to the south, having a look at what Victoria has got in place from their Royal Commission into family violence, about what their approach has been to implementing the recommendations of the Royal Commission into institutional abuse of children. They need to actually start acting collaboratively and not trying to seek the limelight for being number one when they are behind the times and they are not grappling with this issue seriously. It's time for the Berejiklian government to implement these recommendations into law. This bill, introduced by the Shadow Attorney-General, will do exactly that, and for that reason I commend wholeheartedly, strongly and genuinely this bill to the House.
I'd like to thank the member for Maitland. We're in the civil